Okay. So to start off, could you just please say and spell your name?
Jim Sleeper. That's Jim, and the last name is Sleeper.
Great. And can you give me a thumbnail sketch, and you can be as elaborate as you'd like, but give me a kind of autobiographical sketch of your own travels through the world of higher education.
Right. Well, I guess the first thing is I am decidedly not a latter faculty. I have never aspired to be a scholar. I'm a writer, but I don't think of myself solely as an adjunct either, because I just really believe in teaching and I enjoy the teaching. So I would say I would characterize myself as a teacher, not a scholar. My doctorate is an EDD from Harvard Ed School, and I've been teaching in political science, and I've taught at several universities, Northeastern, Queens College, NYU, and here at Yale, as well as Harvard. When I was a graduate student at Harvard, I taught several courses, including freshman writing. So I've been in and around selective colleges and others for most of my life, even while mainly being a writer.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
All right?
Now, you don't, as you know, have to go very far to find someone talking about someone or another talking about the crisis in higher education right now. Are you one of the people who feels a sense of crisis? And if so, what is the nature of that crisis? And if not, why do you think so many people are feeling some version of that right now?
I think there is a crisis on two levels. Crisis is a slightly more dramatic word than I would use. I would call it an unsettling sea change. And the sea changes I understand are, number one, is the fiscal. I do think that the precipitous underfunding of higher education by the public is shifting the burdens of its costs more and more onto students as individual consumers. So instead of having liberal education develop citizens or humanists or whatever you want to say, it becomes a careerist, consumerist transaction. I pay and take on debt, so I had better get a job, and higher education becomes reduced to that. That, to me, is a sea change, certainly over what I encountered.
Yeah, so can you talk about how you've seen that over the years that you've been involved in universities?
Yes. I just want to mention the other sea change.
Okay.
That is at the level, it's sort of precipitated by this structural shift of debt and funding, which creates a shift from citizen to consumer. And the second thing is, I think it's going on in the larger society so much that the students themselves coming in, even when they're not, and even when they're here at Yale, even if they're on scholarship, there is that consumerist, careerist mentality has become reinforced. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So you're asking now how I have seen this.
Yeah, I mean, what are some of the manifestations of it, and how would you kind of track these changes across time in terms of your own observations?
Well, for one thing, I think they've been going on for a longer time than people are now asserting. In other words, someone like William Deresiewicz, his book Excellent Sheep, he's making an important point. He's putting his finger on something, but he's acting as if it just started happening, and before then there were humanists reigned. Well, I mean, when I taught at Queens College in 1977 and 8 and 9, these kids were immigrant kids. They were working from job to home to school. They were exhausted, and they had a very instrumental attitude toward their education. And the number who I would describe as idealists, there's a little bit in every kid, and that's what you're reaching for, is the humanist, the citizen. But it's always been driven by tremendous pressure. What I get the sense has changed is that the people running the institutions have changed their metrics, their measures of what's good.
Right. They didn't even used to have metrics.
That's right. They didn't have metrics. But, from the trustees on down, first of all, the faculty are more and more free agents. The structural change in terms of a casualization of the academy leads to people who are thinking in less communitarian or humanist terms and more like rats in a maze market terms. You can call it free agent if you want. There's no more collegium, the sense of, the college as a self-governing body of scholars that's maintaining certain traditions partly against or in response to the outside world. That's been replaced by it's not just the casualization, it's the atomization of faculty. I think that has intensified. For example, at Yale, which of course was always anomalous anyway as an Ivy League school, at every faculty meeting 30 years ago, there were certain stalwarts who were there as citizens. John Morton Blum, Brad Westerfield, whatever you thought of their views, they felt themselves to be keepers of the conscience of the collegium. I think that's thinned out. And people come in with ideological agendas that may not be consumerist, but they're narrower agendas. It's not this kind of thing that I believe in. Me, I'm a kind of civic Republican. I think the old colleges should nourish that. I don't think it's...
Have they in your lifetime?
Yes, I do think that when I was an undergraduate at Yale in the late 1960s, that spirit was still there. It was there in Kingman Brewster. It was there in the university chaplain, William Sloane Coffin, who was a well-known activist. And it was there in these old guys on the faculty, like John Morton Blum and these others. They felt themselves as the keepers of that flame. And I think that here, even more than Harvard, going back a ways, but there were people at Harvard, too, who felt themselves that way. Even someone like William Bundy, who was dean, before he wound up in Washington, they believed in this collegium, this humanist deliberative democracy. They believed in nurturing that. They believed in arguing with their opponents in a constructive way, not just scoring points or polarizing. I think that ethos was, if not regnant, it was defensible and viable at these colleges.
And legible.
Huh?
And legible.
Legible as well. I wasn't saying that, but yes, absolutely legible. I mean, Sheila Ben Habib, the political philosopher who's my wife, she remembers being a graduate student at Yale and having mentors who exuded that. The philosopher John Smith, who was then a keeper of the Jonathan Edwards paper. We all have memories, and it is true that we get a little rosy in our nostalgic memories of our youth, and so there's that. But discounting that, there has been a sea change, and it seems to me to have accelerated. It's like a tide that begins running out and is rushing out. Mm-hmm. So that's how I would characterize it. It's not even perceived as a crisis because people are so much immersed in it, they're being carried along by it. That's where the excellent Sheep title is right. There's a lot of sleepwalking going on. Mm-hmm. So
you're pointing to some really complicated and dynamic relationships between the university on the one hand and the wider culture on the other. So given all of that, how would you narrate these, and just in terms of causes and the way these changes kind of roll out over time, how do you see is the university merely reflecting broader changes in the culture, or is there something specific to the university itself that then is maybe feeding back out into the culture, some of these kind of careerist or instrumental attitudes?
No, for the most part, in terms of the colleges, I think it's reflection rather than proaction. I do think the research universities, some of the research scholars come in here already evangelizing for a more corporate, business market-oriented approach to everything.
You see that coming from the scholars?
No, I mean, I think the economists are guilty of that, from Milton Friedman and before. They were progenitors of this national cultural ethos. Homo economicus uberalis, to mix languages and metaphors. I like that, Homo economicus uberalis. That really did become regnant, and that came from the university. Not that there was a lot of receptiveness to it. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. What's good for General Motors. But I think that In other words, certain sections of the universities have been progenitors of the cultural shift, but they are now so lavishly funded by outside non-academic interests that are happy to have them doing that, that it becomes hard to tell the chicken from the egg. We have lavish funding for the creation of centers, institutes, virtual think tanks that are cranking out this stuff under the imprimatur of universities. So who's to say if it's coming from the universities or it's, and you know how I feel that Yale has been overtaken by a plethora of institutes and centers that are funded by non-academic people who are eager to harness scholarship, in quotes, to produce what they want. And certainly in scientific research, there's a big scandal going on. I'm not saying that that's true at Yale, but the research and it's predetermined and overdetermined, paid for by the pharmaceutical companies or others who are funding it. So there's a bit of a chicken-egg answer that I have to your question. However, at the collegiate level, I think the universities are the victims. The colleges are the victims and not the creators or the generators of this cultural sea change. I think that the old attempt to uphold the humanist ideal was real. It may have been feeble, hypocritical, and weak. You know, we had William F. Buckley charging it was weak in one way, but it was not in itself solely devoted to the markets. And I think that this kind of, it's a combination of conservative free marketeering and neoliberal world is flat global economics that is transforming even collegiate liberal arts education, not the other way around.
Victimization is a really interesting formulation. So victimized by who or what? Is it state legislatures?
I want to sort of withdraw the word victimization because it carries all these connotations of older debates, blaming the victim. I don't want to cast, look, as I said a minute ago, so many faculty were only too quick to become complicit. The seductions of, So, was Adam victimized when Eve gave him the apple, or was Eve victimized? It wasn't. Somebody was the tempter. Somebody was the proactive initiator, and it wasn't the colleges. So in that sense, they are not as much to blame. I don't want to call them victims, because they were always, for God, for country, and for Yale. Yale country came first. There was always this kind of sense of indebtedness to and being of service to the workings of the larger society. And let's not pretend that places like Yale very often challenged the parameters of the, kind of liberal capitalist republic that America was. They tweaked the balances. So I want to withdraw the word victimization, but maybe your question still applies. I'm not sure. You're asking...
So if... I guess, just who's on the other side of that knife, I guess, is what I'm asking. Okay. Is it state legislatures? Is it kind of the kids coming through the door into the institution having been primed by their schools and their college counselors to insist on a certain kind of, product, not even education, but product.
That's right, the equation of consumerism with a BA. What will it get you? Look, every kid at 18 comes in after 10,000 hours on the internet and 10,000 hours in the shopping mall. I don't literally mean the numbers, but they've been, I don't want to say brainwashed, but yeah, kids come in at 18 unless they went to very unusual schools, which some did at places like Yale. The average American high school kid, let's face it, they've already been inundated and in effect brainwashed by a consumerist society. And so they come in here bringing that. And every college teacher knows what it is to encounter kids who have to be sort of awakened, you have to turn on a little spark that is still there, but you have to ignite it or blow on it to get it to come to life. And I feel that college teachers have always faced that challenge. Lewis Lapham once wrote a great line about Yale that I can paraphrase. He said, the average Yale instructor had a kind of indulgent smile on his face because he knew that his job was to put a veneer of Western civilization on top of the expensive furniture that was on loan to him from Westchester and Long Island. You know, here is where you will be spending a lot of money. Here is London. Here is Paris. Here are here is the Medicis. You know, there was always that feeling that the kids were coming to us already overdetermined. But, and you always, as you know, you always reach in every class, you spot the 3 or 4 kids who are still, haven't yet been foreclosed by a careerist endgame. And their minds are opening. And that's why some senior professors love teaching freshman seminars, because the kids, for all that I just said, there are some kids there who have not yet been socialized into the career track. So, I don't think it's victimization. I don't think it's that the kids come in. The kids do come in pretty much overdetermined, but they're still malleable. And what the teachers are like depends on how much pressures they're under and how they themselves have been nurtured. One critique, as you know, has always been that people who are socialized, who are made scholars, are given the wrong set of incentives as teachers. They become narrow specialists, they're taught to just compete for footnotes with their colleagues, and they lose sight of the fact that the kids they're teaching are not about to become apprentices to their methodology. You're not teaching methodology to undergraduates. You're trying to open their minds to the world. And it is true that the way latter faculty work, there are some disincentives to good teaching that are built into that system. There's a tension between educating an 18-year-old and being a scholar. Let's face it, it's a legitimate tension. If you're going to be a real scholar, you're not going to spend as much time. So it's hard to reconcile that. But I think that eternal tension that's always existed has been stretched and perverted. The scholarship has been co-opted toward narrower market ends or scientistic ends. You know, that critique that the over-research, the over-scientization of even the humanities, I assume that's a legitimate critique. You know, the game theorization of political science, which used to be about the grand and tragic questions of human, you know. So I see the two sea changes. The sea change in the level of the culture of the kids, I think it's worse than it was 30 or 40 years ago. I think the 18-year-olds that came in then were more literate and a little more open to other things. But it depended on the time and the group. Mm-hmm. And at the teaching level, I do think the incentives have gotten more perverse. Perverse from my point of view.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about the governance of the university a little bit? Because I know that that's something that you've written about, you've thought about, you've spoken out about.
Well, I have to say, I've never been a participant in the governance of the university because as a lecturer, I don't go to these meetings and vote. So I have both the advantage of, I hear a lot about them, and I have a slightly outsider-insider perspective.
Well, you've made good use, and I would say unusual use, of your status as an outsider. You have not been shy in some of your critiques of this particular university and maybe the university in general. But can you just kind of talk about some of the issues that have mattered to you and the positions that you've staked out for listeners who might not know so much about these things?
I do think that the model of a university faculty as a collegium is an important model that we're losing, but that should be we should find some way to revivify our understanding of it. And the collegium really goes back to the Middle Ages. You had scholars, of course they were doing it for religious reasons, but it's a company of scholars, to use the phrase that's still sometimes used, a company, not in the sense of a corporate shareholder company, a bonded together group of people who, in the name of keeping alive the light of humanism and of scholarly disinterested pursuit, separate themselves slightly but determinedly from market and state. And they conceive the university as having that slight distance from both market and state. It thrives best in a republic, a civic republic, but it is not subservient to it. It serves it by being itself, by being slightly independent. And it is the independence of collegiums that has given universities their dignity and their capacity to contribute something original to markets and states. So the governance of universities, it's problematic. On the one hand, if it's a private university, the job of the trustees, in this case the Yale Corporation, should be to keep the lights on, which is a metaphor for providing good facilities and raising money, and leave the collegium to determine all the rest in the model of the university as standing slightly apart. So you have to find these weird creatures called trustees who, on the one hand, are usually themselves creatures of the market because they're the ones who have the wealth and know how to raise the wealth and know how to manipulate the wealth to keep the endowment up. You have a tension that they are supposed to, at the same time, as our trustees claim to do, to have such fond memories of what liberal education was in their youth and should be, and so much concern for the republic, which is not just a consumer paradise, that they are willing to give philanthropically of their time and of their wealth to the capital campaigns and to the endowment in order to keep the rest of us free. And we give them our gratitude and our respect if they do that. And well, lately, what's happened in governance is trustees have tried to take the collegium on these rides into market riptides. Let's go to Singapore. There's a burgeoning new market of rising young Asian middle classes. Singapore wants to stem its brain drain. We can, we don't know. Yale claims it's not getting a dime. I don't happen to believe that, but go prove it. There are no fingerprints. But these guys were investors in Singapore's sovereign wealth fund for 20 years before we, So I think they have taken the collegium on a ride. And at the same time, in the public universities, as we all know, the public financing that kept the universities somewhat apart from markets by allowing them to function without having to have their tin cup out has been decimated. University of Wisconsin used to be 70% funded by the legislature of Wisconsin. Now it's funded 19%. So they have a grand strategy program that's funded by Hertog, or one of these guys. Not Hertog, a different guy. They're all just out there with their tin cups. So that's a change in the governance structure. Look at what we saw at the University of Virginia, where the Board of Visitors, which is the trustees, wanted the university to get big into MOOCs and into other kinds of things that they believed for algorithmically driven, market-driven metric models was the way to go. They hadn't thought through the pedagogical or curricular implications of going with those models. And they fired a president who, I don't know the details, I'm not going to defend her as being the greatest president, but she was dragging her feet on that agenda because she was resistant to it. They tried to fire her, and there was a revolution from the collegium. And the students, God bless them, they rose up. And they said, no, we're not here just to ride this horse, to surf these market riptides. We're here to stand slightly apart. And people call that ivory tower elitism. But it's not. It's something that Thomas Jefferson recognized was essential. That's why he founded the University of Virginia. It's to cull an aristocracy not of blood and wealth, but of talent and virtue. That's what these colleges are supposed to be doing. And they're supposed to be nurturing civic, Republican, citizen leaders, in my view. And the governance structures, they don't exactly crush that, but they are seduced by the siren songs of other priorities. And there are market imperatives. If you're a public university, the market imperatives are they're irresistible. There's a comment that George Pearson, the former historian of Yale, made to Lapham. he said, universities are like little boats in a current, and some of them are trying to tack this way and some of them are trying to tack way, but they're all being carried toward the lee shore, which is over the waterfall of market fundamentalism. So that was a conservative, sort of saying, we got to watch this consumerization.
When was that?
Lapham has a great essay in which he quotes that. It's called Quarrels with Providence. It's his great essay about Yale. It ran in the Yale Alumni Magazine. Just Google Lewis Lapham and Quarrels with Providence, and there's this 15,000-word essay in which he quotes George Pearson. So I think he interviewed him in the 1990s.
90s, okay.
Yeah.
So can the mission of the university withstand these market pressures? Well, first of all, is there more to say about the kind of tug of war between educators and non-educators for the soul of the institution? I mean, you've kind of talked about the contours of that.
Well, that goes back to your governance question, too. I think that's what the faculty was trying to do when it passed that resolution expressing grave concern about Yale's Singapore venture. The faculty, if it chose to, could still assert itself enough to resist some of these pressures. It gives a rubber stamp or pro forma approval to things like the Jackson Institute or these other heavily funded things that are eviscerating, I think, the departmental and scholarly structures in favor of these more market-oriented or national security statist-oriented programs. I'm not a big defender of the old disciplinary departmental silos, as they're called. Don't doubt that there should be a reformation of liberal education outside of the narrow disciplinary fiefdoms. Your own field is interdisciplinary in the best sense. American studies, American civilization programs have tried to be that. They've tried to get around the kind of narrow silo thing. So I would like to see a reassertion of faculty power in senates and collegium type modes that would reform what's rigid in the old departmental structures, but that would stand up and rebuff this proliferation of semi-scholarly think tank-like centers and institutes, so that we have kids studying with Professor David Petraeus or Professor Stanley McChrystal or Professor Tony Blair. Come on, So that's what I would like to see. I believe that if the faculty could rise up and do that, it would still be felt. It was felt at the University of Virginia. The trustees backed off. Even here, after the faculty passed that resolution opposing a lot of the Singapore venture, it didn't stop the Singapore venture, but 3 months later, Levin announced his resignation, the presidency of Yale. There may have been other factors, but clearly that was something. Faculty still have that residual power. The question is, do they still understand themselves as the bearers of that responsibility and that power?
Mm-hmm. Right, which then it gets back to the question I was beginning to ask before. Do you see the mission of the university surviving this moment?
To me, it's an open question because I do think it's partly dependent not only on what I just mentioned, the possibility of reviving faculty will in the collegium sense. It also depends on exogenous things that happen. If, for example, there was another meltdown, market collapse, or some huge foreign policy crisis like this new war that we're getting into with ISIS, this could reformulate people's assessments of the neoliberal paradigms, metrics, and parameters within which the bad changes are now taking place. In other words, the reason I think we're sleepwalking into this stuff is because the paradigms are so regnant, so dominant. The world is flat kind of neoliberal paradigm. And liberal education says the world isn't flat, it has abysses that open suddenly, and you have to have a language and ability to go at that. I think it would take a new, I hate to say this, but it would probably take the opening of a new abyss beneath the floor of neoliberal conventional wisdom for the university to recover its ability to stand apart. Since I tend to think that that kind of abyss or meltdown or thing is inevitable, in other words, I think the present conventional wisdom is going to implode in some fashion. I don't, you know, since that's going to happen, I think that people who care about universities should be on the lookout to help reframe people's understanding. In other words, the conventional wisdom that has struck so many of us as being so dominant in our students' minds and even in many of our colleagues' minds, I don't think it's going to last. But whether it will be replaced by something even more Orwellian, I can't say. I don't think it's within the power of universities as governing, as polities or as institutions to single-handedly change that. I don't see that. But there could be moments of resistance or reconstitution of universities in reaction to these changes that might give them a new leverage. It's kind of a diffuse answer, I must admit. I don't know. To me, the answer is it's an open question.
So one of the people that I was speaking to recently said that one way to look at this is that the old bargain that kind of explained the zenith of the post-war university, the bargain between the private sector and the public sector over how research was going to get done and knowledge was going to be produced, that bargain has totally broken down.
Yeah.
And that whatever we're going to do, it's not going to be a matter of going back to that model. We have to kind of move forward to something different. Do you agree with that? And what would that something different look like?
I agree that in the present circumstances, there seems to be no stopping of the inundation of research and university teaching by market forces, whether through donations that are explicitly targeting stuff or even through just these metric models of MOOCs and this kind of marketing of education itself, even if the research is not perverse. The pedagogy becomes perverse.
Right.
So
it's generating content.
Right, exactly.
Yes, okay.
So I don't see a way of stopping that. I don't know if I'm circling back to my same answer. It's going to depend on some breakdown in that inundation. The contradictions within those market forces are themselves producing all kinds of resistances. I'm still back on your question of do I see the university as a locus or a center of renewal of a different model? Is that answering your
Well, yeah. I mean, I'm very interested in the relationship you see between the mission of the university and the state of the republic. And you've talked about that in a lot of different ways, just now in our conversation, but in general over the years, you've written about it a lot.
If you follow Alan Bloom, there's an even tension between the university and the republic, even at its best. The college, liberal education at its best, is somewhat in tension with a republic that wants Platonic guardians and, liberal education's job is to question and not just facilitate. And the republic needs loyal citizens, myth makers, all the adhesives, and liberal education. But I do think that there's a balance that can be struck between providing society with narratives and adhesives that are kind of sustaining of the society, of the polity, and remaining skeptical and asking questions rather than just knee-jerk facilitating whatever is dominant. So I think that some people within the university will become the mythopoeic creators of the new narrative of a national or political coherent destiny. People need those things. We're never going to get away from the need for that. But there will be others who will always try and break that down. And that, I think, is healthy, that tension between those two functions. Does that answer it?
Yeah, so in policy terms, If you could do anything, if you could make a few tweaks and adjustments and implement new policies here and there, what are the points of intervention that would seem most promising to you? What are the policy changes that you might suggest to reverse, or maybe not reverse, but at least change the course that we seem to be on in terms of the trajectory of higher education?
On the level of sustenance of funding, of fiscal, I would definitely reverse the proportions of public funding, get it back to 80% funding from the legislatures for the public universities, definitely. And in the private universities, if I could wave a magic wand, I would have more disinterested donors, the people who are so sentimental about the old college that they give millions without putting any strings on it. What I would do is disappear the Roger Hertogs, the people who have an agenda, and they come sweeping in to fund institutes with agendas. So that's the first change is on the level of funding, more disinterested private philanthropy for the privates as well as the publics, and the publics need, since they don't have as many wealthy donors, they need the legislatures to rethink what they've been doing.
Can the public, as you see it, be retrained to think again about education as a public good? Or has the sun set on that?
Well, that goes back to our larger question of what's happening to the general political culture. If you see the United States today as a republic in which citizenship is giving way to consumerism, and only consumer sovereignty and shareholder value are the measures of what is good, and people go on believing in the invisible hand will work out all the rest, then there's no way of countering, of getting people to rethink of education as a public good, because they will continue to think of it as, how do I get my career? How do I go in as an individual, take on this debt, and pay it off by becoming a good lawyer? And if that's what people are going to think, and that is the whole powerful weight of the logic of society today, is to think that way. We don't have people thinking for the good of the country anyway, so how are they going to think of the good of education for the good of the republic if they don't even think of the country? I mean, John Kennedy saying, ask not what you can do for yourself, ask not what your country can do for you, but that's actually it's an amazing statement when you think about it now. I never thought I'd be thinking of it as so radical. But the extent to which we've gotten to people just thinking about, look, to the extent that inequality deepens and that crises with the rest of the world deepen, it becomes every man for himself. Sauve qui peut, man the lifeboats. And that's what I see happening in our society. It's a man the lifeboats ethos. The number of people who, out of a civic generosity, think that they can enlarge their self and ennoble their self by giving them their energies to a good larger than themselves. There are a lot of people like that in America. Thank God there are, but I think they're under increasing strain. I think that's the message of books like George Packer's The Unwinding, which he's writing as a reporter. That's what I feel. And again, I don't want to romanticize the past. Because as Lapham was saying, let's not think that these prep school kids at the old Yale were all civic generous. Some were, but, So, I guess one question I ask myself, partly in connection with the question you just asked, is, am I just being a little too much of a Cassandra? Do I find my critical edge by painting a dark scene and then saying we have to stand up against this dark scene that I've painted? Do I like that dialectic for my own dramatic or literary reasons? It's a good way to generate narratives, to create or should I be a little more sanguine and say that with a few policy changes? I don't know. everywhere I look on the horizon of the American public society, the reason people can't think of education as a public good is the reason they can't think of the public as a good. It's not just education. They just approach everything with this kind of mouse rats in a maze eye view, which is the quickest way to get from here to there.
Mm-hmm. How do you account for that?
I think it's the shift from, I think it's the increasing, accelerating power of for-profit, market-driven, casino-like financing. The casino-like financing and the increasingly intrusive and intimate nature of consumer marketing, which is practically groping us. Our entertainment, our news programs, which are run by for-profit corporations, they bypass your brain and your heart, and they go right for your lower viscera because they know that's what gets to your wallet. That glues your eyeball to the screen, gets you to watch the commercials. The power of that has accelerated so much from what I thought it was in my youth, where we all remember sailing trashy commercialism in the 60s. But the counterculture became the over-the-counter culture overnight. It was capitalized upon and marketed. And the market forces just absorb everything in this protean way. And they even began to market black power, niche marketing, whatever. They're perfectly comfortable with marketing anything. So that I think those forces have become so powerful, and then changes in the structure of capitalist governance itself, in which it's just this algorithmically driven vision of shareholder value that drives corporate managers. They lose their jobs instantly if they don't go for the quarterly bottom line gain, which means they cannot make socially rational decisions, which means that their marketing is quick hit, implicitly degrading of reflection, of personal virtue, whatever the Republican. It goes right through that. And the power of it is greater than it was when I was a boy. It just is. We also grew up in the shadow of World War II, where everybody had been in the army, everybody had seen everyone else in his underwear. It was a kind of democratic. I'm not going to romanticize that because I know only too well how bad it was in many ways. But the GI Bill grew out of that, which was disinterested in the sense that, it was career people, but they didn't know how to set the kind of limits that they do now. But back to your question, I don't think people can think of the public anymore because the forces of investment and marketing have intensified, accelerated, and narrowed in ways that are like a tsunami. And I think it's amazing, to counteract my own Cassandrism, I have to give people credit for being as good as they are these days. I mean, the students that I teach are good kids, and they haven't been totally conquered by this. Of course, 10 years out of Yale, sometimes, I've had an interesting thing, I'll just mention. Lately, a number of my former students who have been 10 years out, they've come circling back to have dinner. They say, it's like I can tell they're sort of saying, well, I clerked for a federal judge, that was okay. Now I'm at a white shoe law firm, and my God, it's empty. Or now I'm at CNBC as a producer for Jim Cramer, and my God. And they come back to have dinner with me as if I had an answer. But I've had that happen a lot. So lately. So I think that's a straw in the wind, that there's a dissatisfaction. But who can focus and generate that? That was what we thought Obama was doing in his 2008 campaign. He was giving voice and direction, so we thought. Turns out he wasn't. He wasn't enough of a counterweight. He was an antidote to some of the poisons, but he was not a leader in the direction of that. So that's been a big disappointment for a lot of us who hoped that would happen. And I think that and then Occupy was a kind of bottom-up thing, a reaction to that failure. That didn't have enough leadership or paradigms. So I don't know the answer, how you get people to think about the public again. What I do know is that the desire to think about the public is irrepressible. It may seem implausible politically at any given moment. It always seems to be irrepressible. So you get the Tahrir squares no matter how it turns out. Or you get what's happening now in Hong Kong, they're going to lose. But it's, you know, the Chinese government's not going to give an inch. You know, but this is really important. So we're waiting for a new myth, a new paradigm, a new leadership, a new political philosophy or political grand strategy, to use a term, that I don't claim to have. I can aerate these questions. I'm not, you know, visionary enough or enough the leader to say. That's how I see it. So I see the universities, I agree with George Pearson, they're kind of bobbing along on these tides, trying to tack this way and that way, but sort of being carried inexorably. That's how I feel about the Yale and Singapore thing. We made the remonstrance, but it rolls on.
Mm-hmm. Talk about your teaching a little bit. Is teaching in some ways an antidote to all of these things? When it's you and your students in the classroom, do you feel that you're able to address these kinds of things in a meaningful way?
Yes, I think that the combination of the readings and the discussions we have, it brings out this side of the kids. It revivifies and gets them asking these questions. And it does ignite a little spark or breathe a little oxygen onto that spark. I think that that is good. The evaluations that they write say that. But my experience is that 5 and 10 and 15 years out of Yale, which I'm now old enough to see students who have been out of Yale for a while, they give up. They're unhappy. They have a divine discontent, let's put it that way. The number of them that are really pioneering great solutions, there are some, but it's hard to say. One of my students became the digital director of Obama's 2012 re-election campaign. But now he's out marketing his data mining techniques to corporate, he's making a great living. He got Obama reelected by doing stuff that we don't approve of, all this data mining and surveillance and, intrusive matching of people with their friends to get them to recruit their friends to vote for Obama. So he believed in Obama. He used to get teary-eyed about Obama. He really did. But now look what he's doing.
They'll get you. Well, this has been really interesting and great. Is there anything we haven't talked about that we should have?
No, but I've really, I wish I had. I feel like I don't have enough to contribute. I'm glad you asked about the teaching. I do take some satisfaction from that. And there are always a few kids who are just resistant all the way. They're just headed for Goldman Sachs and they believe in it and they just think they have to indulge me. But there's a lot of kids in between, and I like seeing that. I like sowing those seeds of divine discontent. And I think that's what we should do. That's what liberal education has always been since Socrates, is it not? And you hope you're not going to be asked to drink the hemlock, but you're going to go on corrupting the youth. You know what I mean? You're going to be on sowing these seeds of divine discontent because that's what makes them citizens and not just consumers. So I wish I had the larger institutional meta answers. I don't.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.